What we're going to talk about now is the idea of nested for loops. We've already found out that I can nest structures inside of other structures. We have put if statements inside of ifs, and we put if else inside of ifs, and we have even put if else inside of for loops. But what I'd like to do is to put a for loop inside of another for loop. And when I think of a nested for loop, the idea of an Excel spreadsheet always comes to my mind. An Excel spreadsheet is made up of a series of rows. As I look at this spreadsheet, I see row 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's imagine that my spreadsheet is made up of 10 rows. Each row is made up of individual columns. So row 1 has column A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. I'm going to assume, because I have a for loop inside of another for loop, that whatever I am doing as I am sitting on a column is going to be repeating the same thing over and over again. Otherwise, I wouldn't need a for loop. So we're going to find out that my outer for loop is going to control what row I am sitting on. When I am sitting on a particular row, my inner for loop is going to control what column I am sitting on. Column A, column B, column C, or column D. So let's see if we can implement that in a Java program. So I'm going to create a Java program that I'm going to call nested fors. I'm going to put a little bit of pseudocode in here so I can remember what I'm doing. I'm going to find out that the outer for is the one that controls the row that I am sitting on, and the inner for loop is going to control the column that I'm sitting on. So I'm going to build my first outer for. I'm going to create a loop control variable. This time, instead of calling it count, I'm going to call it row. And I'm going to set it equal to 1 because we're going to start on row number 1. I'm going to say as long as row is less than 10. Let's say, for instance, that I have 10 rows in my spreadsheet. And then I am going to increment the row that I am sitting on. I'm going to call this one the outer for loop. So whatever I put inside of these braces is going to determine what I am doing when I am sitting on an individual row. Let's see, for instance, row 1. What am I doing when I'm sitting on row 1? I'm going to write a little bit of pseudocode. What I'd like to do is I'd like to print the row number. And then after I've done that, I would like to print, let's say, for instance, there are 6 columns in my spreadsheet. I would like to print the column number, which means I'm going to print 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6. The next thing that I would like to do is to force a new line because I want to print the column numbers all on the same line. Once I've done that, on the first row, I would like to actually pause my program for just a minute so I can see what it's done when it sits on row 1 before it moves on to row number 2. And the best way that I know how to do that is to create a scanner and to just do an empty read. So this is what I want to do on each one of the individual rows. Pretty sure in order to do an empty read, I'm going to have a scanner. If I'm going to have a scanner, I'm going to have to import it and create a scanner variable. So let me do that next. So I'm going to import my scanner at the top, and down here I'm going to create a scanner variable. Once I have my scanner, I'm just going to fill in some of this pseudocode. The first thing that we said that we wanted to do was to print the row number. So I want it to print a text field that says row number, and then I want it to print row 1, and then I want to force a space so that anything that comes after that is not mashed up next to it. I am going to use a system.out.print because I don't want to force a new line yet. The next thing that my pseudocode said is that I want to print the column number. I want to print 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Because I want to repeat the same thing over and over again, this would be a really good place for another loop. I'm going to use another for loop. And this time I'm going to call my loop control variable column because this is going to determine what I am doing as I am sitting on a particular column. So let's start at column 1. And how many columns did we say that we were going to have? Did we say that we were going to have 6? And so then I'm going to increment my loop control variable. So I'll put a name on my closing brace saying that this is my inner for. We decided what we wanted to do is I want to print 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and so on. Once again, this seems a lot like a print line, so let me build a print line. And all I want to do inside of here is just to print the column number. Column is going to start at 1. The next time it'll do 2. I'm going to use a system.out.print because I don't want to force a new line after each one of the times that it prints my column. Once I have finished doing that, the next thing that we said we wanted to do is to force a new line. So I'm going to use my system.out.print line to do that. And the last thing that I said that I wanted to do is stop. I just want to stop and see what is occurring. I want to kind of halt the execution of my program. And I'm going to do that by using an empty read with the scanner that I'm created. All right, so I'm just going to do an empty read. I'm not going to read it into anything, and I'll just do a .next read. In order to compile it, I am going to have to put that plus sign. I forgot to concatenate my row number with my row variable, my loop control variable. So let's run it and see what happens. I'm going to compile it, see if it works, and then we're going to run it. So when I'm running it, I'm sitting on row 1, and I can see that the first thing that I did inside of row 1 is that I printed out that text field. I printed out the row number and a space. The next thing I'm going to do is to drop into a for loop. I'm going to set my column variable, my loop control variable called column to 1. And as long as that is less than 6, all I'm going to do is print out the value. Then I am going to force the new line, and then I am going to pause and wait. And if you'll notice, it said row 1, and then it printed out 1 through 5 because we didn't go all the way up to 6. And now it is just waiting. So if I key in something else, now it's going to move to the next execution of my outer loop, which is now going to say row 2. And it's going to repeat those same processes. It is going to print out the row number. It is going to drop into the inner for loop, which then will print out the numbers 1 through 5. It is going to force a new line, and it's going to wait for me. So it'll do this for each of the 10 rows. And once it's done, then it will drop out of the entire loop. So if I were to comment out this empty read, it's a little bit like a test print statement that I use to see what's going on in my program. If I comment that out, and I notice that we are not going all the way up to row 10, I'm going to make this less than or equal to. I'm going to make this less than or equal to 6. Now we should go all the way up through 10 rows and all the way up through 6 columns without pausing my program. So now when I run it, I can see my original idea of going from rows 1 to 10. And on each row, I'm counting from 1 to 6. So let's see if we can do something a little bit more interesting besides just printing rows and columns. How about if I prompt the user for the length and the width of a rectangle and ask them for a character, and then I'm going to print out a rectangle of their chosen size using the character that they have given me. So let me write a little bit of pseudocode in here of what I'd like to do. So I'm going to prompt them for the height of the rectangle, and then I'm going to prompt them for the width of the rectangle, and the last thing I'm going to do is prompt them for the character that they would like to use to draw the rectangle. So once I have those 3 values, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to need to create an outer loop that will control the height, which is the number of rows. Inside each one of those rows, I need to create an inner loop that is going to control the width of my rectangle. And inside of the inner loop, what I would like to do is I would just like to print the character that they have given me for. All right, so I already have my scanner that we created earlier, but I am going to need a couple more variables, one for height, one for width, and one for character. So I'll create those now. All right, so I'm going to create 2 integer variables, one called height, one called width. I'm going to declare those on the same line because they are both integers. And then I'm going to create a char variable called character that I'm going to initialize to null. Then we're going to prompt for the height, and then we're going to capture it. So we're going to repeat the process. Once I've prompted them for the height, we're going to repeat the process for the width. And the last thing that we were going to do was to prompt them for the character that they would like to use to draw their rectangle. All right, and if you remember the way that we read a single character is I use my scanner response.next. This will read in an entire word. And then if I do a .char at, this is going to pull a character from this position 0, out of the word that it just read using the .next. All right, so the next thing that we needed to do was to create an outer loop for the height. So I'm going to create an outer loop. We're going to start it at 0, or let's start it at 1. And as long as my loop control variable is less than the height that the user gave me, we will continue to loop, and then I'm going to increment that. I'll call this my outer for. On the inside, I'm going to have another for loop. I'm going to have another loop control variable. I'm going to call this column. We will start with my column equal to 1. And as long as my column is less than the width that the user gave me, I'm going to continue to loop. And what I'd like to do on each width is I just want to print the character that they gave me. but I want to print it all in the same line, so I'm going to use the system.out.print and not a print line, because I don't want to force a new line as I am sitting on a single row printing out each one of the characters for the width. So this is literally going to print the character. But once I have done printing the characters for that particular column, or whatever that width is, then I want to force a new line before I move to my next row. So I'm going to put a print line. Once I drop out of that inner 4, I've done whatever I've wanted to do on that particular row. I'm going to force a new line, and then we'll hit the outer loop. It looks like when I try to compile it that I am missing my parenthesis to close my inner for loop. Let me compile it one more time. The expectation is it's going to run my upper loop, and it's going to ask me for the height of my rectangle. Let's say that I want my rectangle to be 7 rows high. How wide do I want it to be? I want it to be 14 rows wide, and then it's going to ask me for a character. Let's put a pound sign. And let's see if I can get a rectangle made out of pound signs that is 7 rows tall and 14 rows wide, 14 columns wide. Let's run it one more time. Let's see if I can get a rectangle that is 6 tall and 40 wide, and we will put an @ symbol. So a nested for loop. The outer for loop controls what is happening when I move from row to row to row. The inner for loop would control what I'm doing as I move from column to column to column, sitting on a specific row. What I did want to mention to you here, or to bring to your attention, do you see all these closing braces down here at the end of my program? I have 4 closing braces, and if I had not put names on each one of my closing braces, it would become very, very easy to have what I called orphan braces. That's the reason why it's important to label your closing braces. So the next thing that I want to do is to nest more than 2 of them. We'll do that next.